This is the Constitutional Era Objective 1 about how the Articles of Confederation became a necessary prerequisite or forefather to the U.S. Constitution. Now, the place we want to start is simply this. What are the origins of quote-unquote American government? Well, after we won the American Revolution, not that many people had a clue what American government was, or America as a nation. At that time, America was more of a name than it was a country. We were still very British in our customs and our practices and our beliefs. We had relied on Great Britain for decades to take care of us. And while we didn't always approve of how they did, and that's why we broke away, the bottom line was we counted on them for a lot of support. And so independence was great, but now we have to do our own thing, and that's not going to be overly easy. Think about it this way, too. There are still many loyalists in the country, people who were loyal to the British Crown. Even after the British left, even after we broke away, the new nation of quote-unquote America still had a lot of loyalists in the country. So authority is being looked on with suspicion in a lot of different ways. If you were a loyalist, you were suspicious of the brand new United States government. And if you were a patriot, you were still suspicious because, well, the whole reason you fought the war is because you were suspicious of government. So either way, everybody's kind of looking to this new U.S. government and trying to figure out what's going to be involved. One of the big things that people wanted were natural rights, the idea of a right to life, a right to liberty, and a right to property, as quoted by John Locke, L-O-C-K-E, rights that governments could not take away. And that was going to be hard to establish that as well. Finally, our economy was completely struggling. Even when we formed our own country, the British still dominated the U.S. with products that we couldn't produce on our own yet. No matter whether we liked it or not, we wanted to be totally independent of Britain, but they were our chief trading partner, still making the things that we needed to have. So, basically, it was a problem. Overall, the situation wasn't good. We didn't exactly know what we were going to get with this new government or how it would go. It was going to be the grand experiment. But we did have great leaders, and they had a vision, so onward and upward. Now, the first thing we tried was the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation, they were created by the Second Continental Congress in 1776, that's a date you want to be aware of, which was the same year as the Declaration of Independence. They wouldn't be ratified until 1781. Frankly, it took us 5 years while we were fighting in the American Revolution to create a blueprint for a government in case we won. We really didn't know how we wanted our government set up, and because of that, because it was our first attempt, the Articles of Confederation was a flawed document. There's no question about it. But it was a major step to creating the eventual Constitution that we had. But you need to be aware of this, and this is a huge point. From 1781 all the way up until about 1788, 89, depending on when you want to look at the Constitution being formed, for the first 6 or 7 years of our country, our first 7 or 8 years of our country actually, the Articles of Confederation is how we governed ourselves. Now, the Articles of Confederation basically were intended to be the exact opposite of what we had under the British, that being control of a monarch. If you take a look here, once again, you'll see up at the top, they're written in 1776 to 1777, eventually ratified by the colonies in 1781 so that we'd have something in place if we formed our own country. But here was the big thing you want to remember. It basically established a central or national government in our national capital, but that government was extremely weak. Our government had no executive branch whatsoever, okay, nothing resembling a president or a king or anything like that. And each state had their own governor, don't get me wrong, each state had their own governor, but there was no federal office of the executive, whether it be a president or a king. The problem with this is that it was 13 very independent states working together only when there were common problems. Other than that, they were completely independent of each other. If the British decided they wanted to attack Pennsylvania, New York could easily just sit back there and say, oh, wow, that really sucks for you, and not have to do anything about it. There was no U.S. court system, so there was, as far as a judicial branch, there was no U.S. court system. Each state decided the structure of their own court system. So each state had its own Congress, each state had its own court system, and each state had its own executive, the governor. But on the national level, all we had, there was no president, no U.S. Supreme Court, and all we had was the U.S. Congress, which was designed to be very limited in its power. Again, each state had their own Congress, which had far more lawmaking power. So that means no national power to regulate commerce. So states often would have pretty high tariff laws with each other. If you were transporting goods from Ohio into Pennsylvania, let's say, you could get a pretty high tariff amount. But there were other problems as well. Again, no national power to regulate commerce. There is also no national tax collection program. States were basically asked to, now get this, voluntarily offer a contribution to the U.S. Congress. Just volunteer money so that the U.S. Congress can do what it needs to do. In other words, the U.S. government has no real power. The U.S. government could ask states for things, but they could not command or control them in any way. They could not directly punish criminals in a state, nor could they protect themselves from rebellion. Congress in 1783 at one point had to flee Philadelphia, which was the capital at that time, when a mob showed up and the state of Pennsylvania said, well, we're not going to step in and protect you. The U.S. Congress had to run from a mob. That's how little power it basically had. And if you look at this slide, you may want to pause it here and just kind of take a read through. Take a look at the different things that Congress could or could not do. They could not lay or collect taxes. That meant the government was always short of money. No power to regulate interstate or foreign trade, so economic quarrels among the states break out. Could not enforce its own laws. They depended on the states to enforce the laws. 9 states were needed to enact national laws, so it was difficult to enact those laws. Amendments to the Articles required the consent of all 13 states. There was no way to change the power of government then. Again, no executive branch, okay, no court system. There were a lot of inherent flaws with this particular document. And as a result, mobocracy, as the term is called, begins to form. Mobocracy is resolving issues not by voting, but by basically getting a group of guys together that are really upset, carrying pitchforks, guns, whatever, and marching to your local government establishment and demanding change. And if the government doesn't create the change, then you charge inside and you make that change happen by force. We had gotten to the point where the United States of America might as well have been known as the United States of mobocracy. States were getting out of control completely with border disputes, tariffs, money printing, things like that. But one of the things you're really going to want to be aware of is the rebellion of the farmers, also known as Shays Rebellion. Now, Shays is S-H-A-Y-S apostrophe. You know, it was named after Daniel Shays. And Daniel Shays was a war veteran who was getting fined to pay for war debts. He was getting taxed to pay for war debts. Well, he had just gotten done fighting a war against what he thought were stupid taxes from Great Britain. So, you know, basically the government and the economy, remember, when they fought this war, they had to borrow from a lot of people. They had to borrow money from Americans, patriots, however you want to say it. They had to borrow money from overseas. They had to pay for a lot of things in order to fight this war against Great Britain. When the war was over, whether they owed money to foreign nations or to their own people, they had to pay everybody back. And the way they chose to pay everybody back was to fine farmers and other people, raise taxes to pay for the war debts. Well, the war veterans were losing their farms as a result. They couldn't pay off those fines. And when they couldn't pay off those fines, the government was coming in and taking their farms and selling off the land. Well, this is exactly what they'd been afraid of with a new government in their country. So they started to rebel against the government. Now, as a result, there was one major weak point in Shays Rebellion, which took place in Massachusetts, by the way. Shays Rebellion got pretty bloody as the local Shays mob started to rebel against the local governments there. The federal government, which existed with a very weak U.S. Congress, really couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't step in and solve these problems at all. And overall, fearing mobocracy, the upper class in America starts calling for a central government that has a lot more strength to it, a lot more teeth. Shays Rebellion is the main reason for that. Now, eventually Shays Rebellion was put down, But the bottom line is that the upper class, the ones with all the money and all the land, were very fearful that because they were a minority of the population, the majority of the population was the common man. There was great fear by the time we got to 1787 that mobs across the country would start ruling the country and taking away what the elites had. So the upper class in America starts calling for a stronger central government that can step in and solve the mobocracy issue. And as a result, a meeting was planned to create a new governing model. And that meeting was called the Constitutional Convention. Okay? Now, don't get me wrong, there's lots of constitutional conventions. The state of Michigan has had at least 3 of them to this point. But it's basically a meeting when you redo your constitution, whether it be state or national, and you, at that meeting, decide what that constitution and what your new government is going to look like. Well, the first real one in America was the biggest one that created the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Okay, that's it for Objective 1. Thanks for listening.